Michael van der Veen for President Trump, accusing the Democrats of hypocrisy, basically arguing that the president's use of the word fight, that speech he played most of it on January 6th, was perfectly appropriate.
I ask unanimous consent. The Senate recess for a 15-minute break.
Without objection. And there you have, the Senate is going to recess. As we've seen the first couple of hours of the defense of President Trump from his lawyers, Michael van der Veen and David Schoen, it was an angry presentation, aggressive, more an attack on Democrats than a defense of President Trump, though it did include an extended defense from Michael van der Veen of the president's, they said, First Amendment right to say what he said on January 6th. It was unfactual on times as well. Michael van der Veen saying that one of the first people arrested was not one of the supporters of President Trump on January 6th, but a member of Antifa. That is not true. In fact, in none of the criminal cases has anyone from Antifa been cited as one of the protesters at the Capitol. I want to start with John Karl, our chief Washington correspondent. John, as I said earlier, this is clearly the defense that President Trump would want, and in some ways it echoes the defense of his last impeachment trial, where he talked about the transfer of that phone call with the Ukrainian president, saying it was perfectly appropriate. Basically, the president's lawyers arguing here what he did on January 6th was perfectly appropriate.
If you had just stepped into this and only heard this presentation, you might think that the House managers or that the House voted to impeach Donald Trump because he used the word fight, that it was all entirely about his use of that word in that speech on January 6th. Of course, there was much more to that case, but it does echo the last impeachment trial. In fact, George, if you look at the last bit there, where they extensively replayed clips from his January 6th speech, edited clips from his speech to make it sound like it was just fine. But also to get out some of Donald Trump's favorite lines. This was very much focused on their boss, on Donald Trump. They even went back and defended his words on Charlottesville, something that until last year was seen as the low point by many of the Trump presidency. They went and replayed extensively what he said in the wake of Charlottesville to suggest, again, that if you play the full context, somehow there was no problem with what he said. But I will say, I think that this presentation will be considerably more effective among the audience in that room of Republican senators. They'd put it back very much on a partisan line, describing this as a political act of vengeance, this impeachment trial, and playing all those Democrats saying things that could be seen as incendiary, especially some of the president's favorite political opponents, Elizabeth Warren, Maxine Waters, and, of course, even quotes here from Hillary Clinton.
Okay, John, thanks very much. Rachel Scott, what can you tell us how it played in the room?
Well, we know that John Thune, the #2 Republican there in the Senate, was questioning the effectiveness of this strategy to play these videos of Democrats. He didn't see how it would tie all in together and really argue their case that former President Donald Trump did not incite that riot, which is what he is charged with. Inside of the room, the jurors are supposed to be remaining quiet, watching silently. Today, there were murmurs. Today, there was laughter at times. Democrats not really taking this seriously. Senator Amy Klobuchar seen rolling her eyes, Senator Whitehouse seen laughing. Then you had Republicans, Rand Paul, who has been missing for the first 3 days of this trial, notably absent from his seat, sitting there listening intently to what was going on. And then you also had Senator Tim Scott. He was nodding his head when Trump's lawyers pointed out that he told the crowd that day to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. But there is one Republican senator who we've been really keeping our eyes on, and that is Bill Cassidy, George. Of course, he changed his vote, voting to move forward with the trial. We know this is weighing heavily on him. And as he walked into the chamber today, he said there were some unanswered questions that he wanted to hear from Trump's defense team. He wanted them to really piece together this timeline of what did Trump know and when did he know it? Did he know that his vice president safety was in danger when he was tweeting at him to step up and have some courage? He did not get those answers to those questions, at least for right now, George.
Okay, Rachel, thanks very much. Terry Moran, at one point, Michael van der Veen, the president's attorney, said this is not whataboutism, as they played clip after clip, several different occasions of Democrats using the word fight.
This was the Olympics of whataboutism. It was epic to hear, you know, the tables turned. And it is really what our partisan politics are all about right now. It is less about what what you believe than who you hate, and how you can get them, hoist them by their own petard. Did it go to the actual context that the House managers laid out and that the country saw, the context of Donald Trump's use of the word fight and his direction of that mob to the Capitol? It wasn't just that he used the word fights. Let's go down to the Capitol. It was less a defense, as you say, than an attack, a counterattack. And counterattacking with whataboutism is basically what partisan politics has come to in the United States as an effective defense. I actually think it might have been for the political reasons at the bottom of this trial. It basically stokes the Republican base and forces the Republican senators to move to that ground. They've got to be there in some ways, even if they hang on to their constitutional argument that former presidents shouldn't be tried. They're now the red flag has gone up of whataboutism against the Democrats, which gives joy and makes the blood flow hotter in so many people in this country. And I think it will make any Republican thinking of convicting, it'll make them think twice, because they now know that this presentation has been royally effective for the Republican base.
Terry Moran, thanks. Let's bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Pierre, I mentioned at the top here one of the claims that Michael Van Der Veen made about an Antifa supporter being arrested at the Capitol.
Well, we've been looking at the facts, and so far no Justice Department case that we've reviewed has mentioned any suspect involved in the insurrection as having ties to Antifa. That's the review that we've done. And the Justice Department, George, has been very meticulous in laying out the evidence and mentioning the specific affiliations when they can. For example, you've seen the word Proud Boys being used in the documents that we've reviewed. You've seen the word involving the Oath Keepers, a militia, and groups like it. So they've been very precise when they can be. That word Antifa, at least in the documents that we have reviewed, we've not seen it. And when we talk to prosecutors and investigators in terms of the briefings that they've given, when they've been asked that question, they have not pointed to Antifa or like-minded groups as playing any kind of significant role on January 6th.
Pierre, Mr. Van Der Veen also said right at the top that no thinking person could believe that what the president was saying on January 6th was incitement. He did not address the evidence that is coming up in courtrooms all across the country.
Correct. Many of the people who have been charged, again, 20 that we can document so far, have specifically said that they came to the Capitol specifically because of the president, at his direction. You saw, in fact, video being played in which people say we were here at his invitation. So that is an issue. The other thing not really addressed is what I think Terry mentioned, the notion that they were going to go to the Capitol because the president said, go there and I'm going to walk with you, George. Okay,
Pierre, thanks very much. Let's bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams. Assess the lawyering.
Well, look, I think he made a powerful political argument and a weak legal argument. Along the lines of what Terry was saying, I think that this is the sort of argument that Republicans wanted to hear here. It's also a very typical argument you hear of a defense attorney, meaning using it in the trial context again. Typically, you will hear the prosecutors say, look at the totality of the picture. Look at the whole story here together. And that will lead you to only one conclusion. And while defense attorneys will very often isolate a single item and say, are you going to convict based on that single issue? I think you're seeing that here with that fight as hell comment, fight like hell, because you have the House managers presenting a story leading up to that about this dangerous lie of the election being stolen, and then action by action going through that, the president's comments going through that, and that fight like hell becomes the culmination of it, not to be taken in isolation. I should also say it's interesting to see that they've been trying to put the media on trial, interspersing in some of these video montages comments made by some of the people who are there, senators, members of Congress, but then throwing in random pundits saying, I mean, you would think, who cares what these random pundits have been saying, as if that's somehow a reflection of what the U.S. Senate should or shouldn't be doing.
Not just the media, Madonna and Johnny Depp as well at some point.
Right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we did hear at the end there for about the final 20 minutes, most of the final 20 minutes, Mr. Van der Veen going directly at the First Amendment argument, saying flat out the president has a First Amendment right to say what he said, and he leaned hard on that case, Brandenburg v. Ohio.
Yeah, and that's the case that would be relevant in the context of a criminal trial. Meaning, does it rise to that level of being imminent and lawless, which is the standard, very protective standard, for people to be able to say sort of inflammatory things? The problem is, whether it crosses that line or not, his weaker argument is on the issue of how that applies in the impeachment context. Meaning, according to him, the president could be out burning flags. The president could be criticizing the United States. The president could be supporting our enemies publicly in his comments, and that wouldn't be impeachable because that's First Amendment protected speech. That's not what the point of impeachment is. Here we're talking about violating his oath of office. We've seen, for example, abuse of power being an article of impeachment before. And so I think he's on very weak ground when it comes to this idea that if the president is allowed to say it under the First Amendment, that it simply can't be impeachable conduct.
Okay, Dan, thank you. Cecilia Vega, our chief White House correspondent. President Biden made his first extended appearance in these impeachment proceedings on videotape, rejecting the objections in the 2016 election.
As much as he wanted to stay out of it, he was front and center there today, George, and he sort of reiterated what he said yesterday in hoping that this may end up changing some minds today. I want to sort of go back a little bit to what we heard today, though, because it brought me back to covering the Trump presidency, and you'll remember that infamous phrase that Kellyanne Conway used at one point, alternative facts. The defense is really relying on this set of alternative facts here over and over again. I think a lot of people might say that referencing Joe Biden's campaign slogan as a battle for the soul of America perhaps being a bridge too far. You mentioned Antifa and the reality versus what happened on the ground there and who was arrested versus what they were saying there in the chambers about an Antifa arrest. And also, we've heard this from them a couple of times now, but we haven't really talked about it, how they keep honing in on the fact that the Democrats brought this impeachment case after President Trump left office. Well, they didn't bring it while he was in office because Mitch McConnell wouldn't let them schedule it back when President Trump was actually the president. So they're very much arguing this alternative reality, and it felt in a lot of ways like they were playing to that audience of one. I think this is very much a performance that President Trump would, had he had access to Twitter, would have given rave reviews today.
Perhaps we'll hear later what he thought about that. Let me bring in Martha Raddatz. Martha, you were among the rioters on January 6th. What the president's lawyer said he said is not what the rioters, what the protesters were telling you they heard.
And that's not what they heard at all. They were saying they were there to, and I go back to this all the time, stop the steal. It's not going up there to fight for our rights. It's to stop what they thought was a stolen election, what Donald Trump told them was a stolen election. And person after person, rioter after rioter, people just out there supporting Donald Trump said they were there because of what he said, to stop that steal. I was standing in front of the Oath Keepers. The Oath Keepers now, as our Pierre has been reporting, had a larger plan, according to prosecutors, a larger plan of attack, that they had weapons elsewhere. I was standing right in front of a group of those Oath Keepers, and they had walkie-talkies. They were communicating with others, whether they were inside or outside. This is a group of Oath Keepers who had actually been inside the Capitol, and when I asked them if they were going back in, one of them said, no, because I was in the war in Iraq and I have shrapnel in my body and a bad hip. But that was a group of very organized people. They weren't just walking around hassling us or threatening us. They were very, very disciplined from what I saw, and the people I talked to, again, said they were there because Donald Trump wanted them there.
Martha Raddatz, thanks very much. Let me bring in Rahm Emanuel. Rahm, you saw the strategy at play there, counterattack on the Democrats, video after video of Democrats. Is that what enough for Republican senators to hold on to? How do you assess it overall?
Well, I think, first of all, I think actually every one of those jurors went in, except for one, with their mind made up of how they're going to play. Cassidy's the only one that seems to have moved in any way. I think they're all, none of them, I will say this, I can't imagine one of these senators being on the jury for one of these cases that are happening around the country, around the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, etc., because they're not impartial. I don't think this is going to change people's positions. If anything, it's going to probably harden where they are. I don't think in this case they actually did anything to say that Donald Trump, I think your first statement said this, George, and I 100% agree with this, which is this was not a defense of Donald Trump. It was a condemnation of Democrats and the charges they brought. And I don't think that, you know, as we like to say in Chicago, that dog just won't hunt. I don't think that's going to work in that sense. And I do think when you think about politics and going forward, what's happening around the country in these trials of some of the people that were rioted, that's going to be a more lasting impact on the political process. Because I still believe in the end of the day, the Republican Party has got to figure out, are they going to be a party of conservative principles or people that believe in conspiratorial theories and then become co-conspirators? Right now, the Proud Boys are precinct captains for the Republican Party. And until they figure this out, there's going to be a whole group of independent voters and weak Republican voters who don't want to be associated with that. And that's the dilemma the Republicans find themselves in today.
Sarah Fagan, what do Republican senators do with the argument they heard today? Most of them have not wanted to go as far as the president's lawyers were going today by basically saying there was nothing wrong with what he was saying. It's purely figurative speech.
Yeah, I think that hasn't changed. I don't think any Republican is going to want to come out and in any way, shape, or form defend Donald Trump with respect to January 6th. I do think that video was very effective because it reminded Republicans that for 4 years, Donald Trump didn't always get a fair shake and often didn't get a fair shake by elites, by some members of the media, you know, and he basically came into office in 2017, you know, illegitimate in the minds of many people in this country because they just couldn't accept that somebody like him could win the presidency. And that, I think, brought up some raw emotion and probably some anger, at least among the base. It doesn't change the legal arguments. I agree with Dan Abrams. You know, at the end of the day, even if the president didn't intend for people to storm the Capitol and break into the windows, they did it. And his words have to be, his words matter, and he has to be held account in some way. But I do think that video, I mean, the Democrats need to get 17 senators. The council, the defense council, they just need to convince, you know, enough not to support conviction. And I think that helps with their argument. Right. They just need to make sure more than 16 people don't vote to convict.
Yeah, and it seems like they have that going into today as well. John Karl, though, meanwhile, what is happening outside the chamber, you're seeing more prominent Republicans take on the president, his words and his action on January 6th. That interview in Politico this morning with his former UN ambassador, Nikki Haley.
Yeah, Nikki Haley, who is somebody who has been a strong Trump defender. In fact, somebody that didn't criticize him at all during the lead up until January 6th, didn't take issue publicly, at least, with his refusal to concede the election and his baseless allegations of fraud. Did an interview with a Politico reporter, Tim Alberta, on January 12th. So, you know, just about a week after the riot. And said that Donald Trump misled us. And she's talking about Republicans. Donald Trump misled us. We, meaning Republicans, made a mistake to follow him, made a mistake in listening to him. We cannot let that happen again. That from Nikki Haley. The article also goes on to show, though, that Nikki Haley, like so many Republicans, really enabled Donald Trump over the years and didn't come around to making that judgment until you saw the the ransacking of the Capitol and the attempt to truly steal an election.
John Karl, thanks. We're seeing most of the senators having returned to the chamber at this point. Rachel Scott, walk us through what we can expect the rest of the afternoon and into the weekend.
So it appears Trump's defense so far has used about 2 hours. We know they said that they were going to move through this very quickly, maybe using just up to 4 hours of time. They'll come back in. They'll continue to counter what the House impeachment manager said. George, I'm also just getting this in from a senior aide on the impeachment team responding to those claims from Trump's lawyers, saying that the videos were edited. They're saying that that is completely false. The Democrats cut out entirely the context and leveled a false accusation. And we also know that inside side, as they were playing that video, House impeachment manager Jamie Raskin, he was furiously writing notes. They are slamming that back, saying that it is false, that they cut out the context of what they were trying to do and making a false point, George.
Okay, and of course, one of the things they pointed out was Congressman Raskin in his first term in Congress raising an objection to the 2016 results and showing President Biden, at that point, Vice President Biden as President of the Senate, ruling those objections out of order because no senators signed on to it. And in fact, Hillary Clinton had already conceded this election. Terry Moran, going forward, we're also going to have 4 hours of questions after the president's team rests their case, their opening arguments. That's the one place we may find out if any senators are thinking of changing their minds here.
And beyond that, even beyond the votes, how seriously they're taking these proceedings. I think it was Alexander Hamilton who called an impeachment an inquest into the conduct of public men. And an inquest is more than a trial. It's trying to get at the truth. Will we hear in the questions, which must be written according to the rules and handed to the presiding officer who then reads them? We aren't going to have a kind of a mosh pit Senate free-for-all. It's going to be a very formal process. Will we hear an attempt not just to draw out one side or the other, but to get at those facts, to say we do care about what really happened here, even if it might not be enough to sway votes? We'll get a sense of the seriousness of the Senate in those questions, I think.
Yeah, and Dan Abrams, there were some indications last time around in the last impeachment of President Trump. It did reveal what the senators were thinking as they pondered their final votes.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you're going to see some questions, inevitably, of President Trump's lawyers asking from Democrats, do you think the election was stolen, right? What is your position on that? Now, Bruce Castor, in his initial presentation, suggested that the answer to that was no, that the former president lost the election, that the voters had spoken. You know, whether they'll continue to stick with that is an issue. But interpreting, I think, the Republicans' questions is going to be much more interesting in looking at what nuances are they looking for. Is there any opening there based on who's asking the question and who are they asking it to?
And John Carl, do we have any further insight into what Mitch McConnell may be thinking about his final vote? All reports we've gotten from Rachel Scott and others who've been inside the chamber as he sat stone-faced, staring at the presenters through all these hours of testimony, not giving away much. He rarely does.
Yeah, he certainly hasn't. And George, we know two things. One, that McConnell, like 44 Republican senators, has voted twice to say this trial shouldn't even have started, that it was unconstitutional. But we also know that he has told Republican senators, and he has said this consistently for several weeks, that this would be a vote of conscience and that they should listen to the evidence and make their own decisions. There wouldn't be a Republican position on impeachment. We also know that he has been among the former president's most strident critics of his efforts to say the election was stolen. You know, I expect that Mitch McConnell will vote to acquit because he has said that this is unconstitutional, that Trump is already out of office. But I don't know that for certain. I would say that you know, he more than anybody wants to see Donald Trump removed as a political force. Whether or not he would actually suddenly change his view on the constitutionality of this trial and vote to convict, I think is highly, highly unlikely, but not impossible.
Well, and I want to bring that question to Sarah Fagan. Sarah Fagan, is there some do the leaders of the Republican Party have to create some room for both sides here? You talked about how this was effective in riling up the president's base, the Trump base, but the Republican Party has to be bigger than that to win national elections.
Right. Yeah, I think, you know, that's part of the calculation, I'm sure, that's going through Mitch McConnell's head, which is, you know, Republicans have done very poorly with suburban women over the course of the last two election cycles. It's not possible to get a majority of the electorate without Republican inroads in suburbia. And right now, you know, they're giving Donald Trump the stop sign and the Republican Party the stop sign because of their association with Donald Trump. And so at some point, Liz Cheney did a great service to the party as a whole, even though she's taking some real hits back home. Mitch McConnell, could do the same thing. He's got 6 years ahead of him. He just won re-election. It's unlikely that would be an issue for him down the road if he even ran again 6 years from now. So he could, in essence, take it for the team, and that would be effective, even if Donald Trump doesn't exit the stage.
Sarah Fagan, thanks very much for joining now by our other legal analyst, Kate Shaw, Professor Cardozo, Law School. What was your take on the president's arguments from the president's team?
The First Amendment arguments were interesting. If the president were facing some criminal charge, the defense that was mounted actually was fairly compelling, that, the standards for incitement of violence are high and that perhaps the evidence presented didn't satisfy those standards. But it's important to underscore that an impeachment trial is not bound by the rules set down by courts that apply in a judicial process. And so, I think there's nothing that requires a criminal standard be satisfied when voting on whether to convict in impeachment. And I also think, with respect to the First Amendment, it almost seemed as though the lawyers were making the argument that nothing the president said, so long as it was speech or rhetoric, could ever be the basis of an impeachment charge. And I just think that can't be right. You can imagine actually speaking of violence. And, if that were a private person, depending on the context, probably that would be First Amendment protected speech. But of course, the president is not an ordinary person, and so certain things the president says have to be impeachable. And it just wasn't clear that the defense team was willing to concede that. They seemed to be taking a pretty absolutist stance about the First Amendment.
Yeah, they clearly weren't. Of course, this is a political more than a legal proceeding. But as a lawyer, is there any argument that you think they've left on the table that they have to address when they come back into the chamber?
In some ways, this is an argument that is part legal and part political. But in terms of the president's sort of continued failure to really repudiate some of the claims about election fraud, I wonder whether they need to address that in some fashion and really full-throatedly condemn the violence. In some ways, that's not an argument. In some ways, that would be getting their client to actually do now what in some ways he hasn't done to this point. But I do think that's, sort of hanging out there and not really addressed by this team.
Right. And Dan Abrams, on that point, what also seems to be hanging out there is those several hours, and the Democrats made these points during their presentation, where this was unfolding, where the president did nothing to stop the violence as it unfolded.
Well, and that may be one of the strongest arguments that they have against him, because at that point, it's not a question of did he mean to, is there any questions? There, the answer should be any president of the United States would immediately come out and condemn the violence in an effort to quell it. I should add one other thing to what Kate was talking about. Look, there's an argument to be made that the president could have been impeached even without the violence, meaning just the ongoing commentary, rejection of the election results. I'm not talking about in court. I'm talking about the efforts to try to convince the Georgia Secretary of State and others to overturn the election. There could have been an impeachment proceeding just based on that. I'm not saying you get a conviction, but this notion that there has to have been a criminal offense simply isn't supported by the history of impeachment.
Okay, we're 4 days in, Rahm Emanuel, into this trial so far. We're probably going to have it wrapped up this weekend. How big a political impact, political mark do you think this is leaving on the country right now?
3 or 4 things, I would say. It depends. I really do think this is helpful to Biden because it reminds people of why they wanted to reject Trump and turn the page. Second, I think it continues to leave the Republicans in a quagmire that they can't, they can neither support Donald Trump and they cannot shake Donald Trump. I think for the country, if this went on like 2 more weeks, it would be like, there goes Washington, et cetera. And I think that to be honest, it's going to end at a time in which everybody's political interest gets right to, I think, one important thing that I think will be also true for the Democrats and Biden. You look at the COVID numbers, they're dramatically dropping. You look at the vaccine numbers, they're dramatically increasing. And there's some discussion the economy is beginning to make a turn. You want that attention there. And so I don't think it's if you were for Trump, there's only to confirm that he's a victim. If you were against Trump, this is the reason you voted against him to get him out of office, and you're pleased that Joe Biden's there in that effort. And the sooner that everybody gets back to people's business, it's going to be a better politics for everybody around. specifically for Biden and Democrats.
Rahm
They gotta
Emanuel, thanks.
come.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.